Welcome to Echoing Faith Today, a podcast conversation on themes of impact and relevance in the new Directory for Catechesis from the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of the New Evangelization. I'm Dr. Jem Sullivan, host and faculty in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America. On this podcast, we'll hear from scholars, experts, and those in pastoral ministry. So welcome back, and thank you for taking your place at this table of conversation. What does it mean to say that beauty is a path to encounter God? And how does the new Directory for Catechesis speak of sacred music in the church, in catechesis, and in the spiritual life? To shed light on these questions, I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Sir James MacMillan, renowned composer whose music is performed in concert halls around the world, from chamber pieces to full orchestral works and operas. Sir James MacMillan is a prolific composer of sacred and classical music that reflects his Scottish heritage, a close connection to Celtic folk music, and his Catholic faith. So James, I'm so grateful you are joining in this conversation on the new Directory for Catechesis from the Vatican's Pontifical Council for the Promotion of the New Evangelization. Thank you for being with us, and a warm virtual welcome to the Catholic University of America.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be able to join you.
So the Directory for Catechesis offers several new directions, one of which is a theme that you've spoken and written about on many occasions, the theme of beauty. So I thought we might begin with the question, what is beauty in human experience and why is it important?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I suppose right at the beginning, I should say that I've never been involved in any catechesis as far as you and your colleagues would understand it. And so this is entirely new for me. And I bring a composer's perspective to the questions you ask. And I know that in the world of the arts, there is much speculation about what beauty is and what it can be in the modern world, especially considering the convulsions that we've been through culturally, politically, historically, and how the aesthetics of the arts change, the aesthetics of music change, the understanding of what beauty in music is. And I suppose the secular world has a very strange, sometimes, understanding of what beauty is. And it may be quite distant and detached from either a composer's understanding of beauty and the search for beauty, and I would imagine the church's understanding of what beauty is, because it is not necessarily just physical attributes which determine whether something is beautiful or not. And as Christians, as Catholics, we have to search deeper for that, to really probe what it means to be beautiful. What is beautiful in this world? What do we search for as human beings and Christians? And I suppose it all has to come from the person of the living God, the historical Jesus. We don't know if he was physically beautiful or not. We have no idea really what he looked like, but we know a lot about him and his mission on earth, his activities on earth, his relationships with the apostles and disciples and friends, his family, that gives us enough of an understanding of what beauty is, a real sense of beauty. So what we need to look for, and I suppose what I and my fellow composers and artists need to look for, if we are guided by those Christian and religious principles, what is there in the life of Christ, the example of Christ, that we can say is truly beautiful? And does that have a direct impact on what we do as artists, as composers, or simply as the faithful in the world of the 21st century?
You know, the field of catechetics really is, we understand it as an interdisciplinary field. And so we're very grateful to have your voice as a composer from outside the field of evangelization and catechesis, speaking to this issue. The Directory for Catechesis identifies 7 sources for catechesis, one of which is beauty. What is the significance of naming beauty as a source for the church's witness to faith today, to evangelization and catechesis?
You know, I've always been baffled at how reluctant many of the pastors in the church over the years I've been a practicing Catholic have shied away from tackling the question of beauty in the life of the life of the church and the life of the Christian journey. They can talk about many other things and sometimes do it very, very well. And of course, beauty is part of that triumvirate of virtues along with truth and goodness. And I've heard a lot about truth and goodness, thankfully. But strangely and maybe sadly, I don't hear much in the church that explores the issue of beauty. And I say it's sad because it's something that as artists we're in constant search for. And maybe there's something in the concept that has frightened many of our pastors and our preachers away. Maybe there's something in the concept that is just too strange or seemingly irrelevant to the Christian life, and that would be a shame, because I think the role of beauty is directly connected with the other virtues, those classical virtues of truth, which the church seeks for all the time, and goodness, and we've got to bring beauty back as one of the basics. We've got to bring beauty back as one of the basic searches and focuses of the church. And anything we can do from our perspective as artists and musicians to help the church might be useful.
And that's what is so significant about the directory from the Vatican's Pontifical Council for the Promotion of the New Evangelization, naming beauty now as one of the sources of catechesis. So hopefully that will help our pastors and those engaged in pastoral ministry to kind of attend to this in a closer way. You know, the Directory for Catechesis says that in the church, all beauty is concentrated in the person of Jesus Christ, whose gospel is captivating because it is news that is beautiful, good, joyful, and full of hope. And then the document goes on to say that Jesus speaks beautiful words and performs beautiful actions, healing, setting free, accompanying humanity, touching its wounds. How does your work as a composer embody, reflect this way of seeing Jesus's words and actions in the gospel as reflecting truth, goodness, and beauty?
Through the ages, and especially as part of the of Judeo-Christian civilization, artists have, in many ways, sought to discover what it is in the life and the teachings of Christ that they could seek out as the essence of our human mission. And one of the great tragedies of the disintegration of faith in modern life has been that artists and indeed musicians may have given up on that search. But I think there is something about the life of Christ, the person of Christ that should always be a beacon to artists. And I'm encouraged by the fact that many composers, whether they're believers or not today, have found their ways back to the great traditional structures of storytelling in the life of our culture. The way that the story of the Passion of Christ, the crucifixion of the Christ, can actually be painted in sound as well as in picture and in words, and that some of the great musical masterpieces of our culture have indeed been works which told the story of Christ's crucifixion. In fact, some of the greatest works in the history of music, the Passions of J.S. Bach, are precisely that. They are focused entirely on the impact of Christ's mission, Christ's life, Christ's death, Christ's resurrection, of course, and the legacy of this message that it has for history and for eternity. And in some ways, I would suggest that that search for the sacred has never gone away. And the search for the beauty of Christ is as much a compelling necessity in the life of the modern artist, the living artist, as it ever was. And I look at some of the activities of my colleagues, and some of my colleagues are believers, but most of them are not nowadays. But yet, there are still people who are setting the words of Christ and setting the great crucifixion narrative. I can reel off a number of living composers and recent composers, some Christians, some not, but who have been fascinated by this storytelling, this aspect of our great civilizational narrative. It's there at the core of our world in many ways, in civilization and in culture. And I think it's important that we probe it in any way we can. And certainly as a Catholic composer, that is a part of the Catholic composer's mission and vocation to do so.
And along those lines, so James, could you share some of your own works that have been really focused on telling the story of Christ in the fullness of his paschal mystery?
Yes, there are a number of ways that composers can do this, of course. In setting the words of the Passion, composers retrace the steps of J.S. Bach and still do so. J.S. Bach famously wrote a St. Matthew Passion and a St. John Passion. So far, I've written a St. John Passion, which has been performed in the United States. It's been performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. It's commissioned by them or co-commissioned by them, and a St. Luke Passion, which has also been performed in America and co-commissioned by people in different countries. So far, I've set the Passions twice. I have in mind to return to the Gospels and maybe set my own setting of the Mark and maybe the Matthew, if I'm spared. And you can never lose the urgency and the excitement of setting these words in so many different ways. But there are other ways that the Passion can be shaped in a musical structure. The 7 last words from the cross is a form that has been left through history and made famous through the approach of Haydn, the great Viennese composer, classical composer. And there are different ways that we can do that today, and I've set my own version of the 7 last words. The Stabat Mater, of course, is a vision of the crucifixion seen through Mary's eyes, and composers through the ages have turned their attention to that and setting those words. And I've set my Stabat Mater recently. And in fact, one of the last times I was in the United States before this pandemic hit us was for the US premiere, the New York premiere of the Stabat Mater last November. And the 16, the wonderful English choir, came over with the Britain Sinfonia, also from England, to perform that in New York. And I have very, very happy memories of that great cultural meeting of Britain and America. The world of secular music and the world of the sacred coming together in a truly meaningful and memorable and happy occasion. So there are these different forms. But the story of Christ's crucifixion can be painted in pure sound as well. There are some of my works that are just purely instrumental works, which attempt to paint, if that's the word, the narrative in sound. There are 3 works of mine, a triptych of works called Triduum, and Catholics will of course recognize the importance of that word. The first piece is a concertante work for English horn and orchestra called The World's Ransoming. It's the Thursday piece. The Cello Concerto, my Cello Concerto was written for Rostropovich, and it's the Good Friday piece. And then there's a Saturday piece, a symphony, my first symphony, called Vigil. So even in symphonic sound, without words, composers can paint these pictures.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us just a wonderful sense of the breadth of your work as it's dedicated to bringing in sound the story of Jesus. And it's a real blessing to the church and to those who enjoy it outside the church, enjoy your music. The directory goes on to say that every form of catechesis ought to attend to the way of beauty, the via pulchritudinis, since all beauty can be a path that leads to an encounter with God. What does it mean to say, especially in your work as a composer, that beauty is a path to encounter God?
It's very interesting. In my world of music, and my focus in my artistic life is in quite a secular place, I suppose. I meet lots of people and work with lots of people who don't necessarily share my worldview, but because we love music, you tend to find people talking in quasi-spiritual language about the impact that music has on their lives. And you will find agnostics and atheists use terms like the spiritual power of music, and they will give accounts of how music is the most spiritual of the arts. What do they mean by that? They obviously mean something. And maybe it's not too far away from our understanding of the spiritual power of music. Maybe there is something in that encounter with this strange and mysterious and ineffable language and life force of music, a mysterious language which speaks in sound rather than words, where we encounter something which gives us a view of ourselves, a view of this life beyond the sum of our parts. Maybe there's something in music itself and its beauty and its mystery which points all men and women, whether they have a belief or not, towards God. Perhaps there is something in the impact of this art form of music which allows a window to be opened onto the very nature of God. I think that's why I'm still a composer, and why I've pursued this life in music. It's based on a kind of understanding that this is probably true, and that through music one can encounter God. And in that understanding, and it's an understanding which seems to be drawing all men and women, and all many different types of men and women, towards the world of music, we encounter a beauty together. And we, I think, feel that we know that this has something to do with the nature of God. And perhaps in their own way, those people who do not share their faith are involved in a very similar parallel journey themselves.
And this pointing, as you noted, this window opening to transcendence, we need that now more than ever, both in the church and in the world, as we struggle through the challenges of this recent year, this past year, but also just all of the things that face the human condition. More than ever, the church then needs to return to beauty as a path to encounter God. Because as you said so beautifully, it really is that opening, that window to transcendence for all people.
Yes, I agree with that. And you're right. I mean, this pandemic has given us a hunger for the beauty of life, the beauty of life to return. And music can be a vehicle for that. It can bring people together. There's a great healing quality in music, even music that can sometimes, and the other arts which can sometimes paint difficult pictures, and indeed the painting the crucifixion in word and image and music is painting a dreadful scenario, but it's perhaps something of the ability of the artist to step up to the edge of the abyss and reach into it. That gives music and the arts a very special power. Music and the arts can be a kind of ally to the nature of God and the power of God to bring about a healing in our world. It can perhaps even save our world from the abyss that it sometimes faces. And the pandemic has been a dreadful experience that points to a sense of hunger, a sense of loss, and the great divisions in our society that are playing themselves out in all over the world. These things need to be healed too. I sometimes tell people the strange story of who was the patron saint of music before the church embraced Saint Cecilia as the great patron saint of music. And of course, Saint Cecilia is a very important saint in the life of the church. But before that was established, many of the musical guilds in Northern Europe venerated another figure from Scripture, and that figure was Job. And one wonders why Job became a patron figure for the musician in Europe, in the Middle Ages in particular. And I think it's because there are old paintings and drawings and woodcuts of Job from that time, the Middle Ages, being visited by musicians. Musicians came to Job, at least in the popular imagination, to bring solace, to comfort the afflicted, to comfort the suffering. And there is something in the figure of Job and these images of Job being comforted by music and by musicians that perhaps still has a place in our world today. Our world is crying out for a healing and a sense of solace, a healing of the suffering, a healing of a sense of alienation from ourselves, whether it be enforced through a pandemic or through politics or through social division. We need to be healed by this, healed of this, and music can continue to offer that possibility and opportunity.
That's so fascinating, James, with the image of Job, because, at the end of the story of Job, it's such a hopeful story because he does get restored. To go back to the directory, the text notes that the musical heritage of the church, of inestimable artistic and spiritual value, is also a vehicle of the faith and constitutes, it says, a precious asset for evangelization, because it instills in the human spirit a desire for the infinite. You've already spoken about this a little bit, but explore with our audience how sacred music, the heritage of the church, is a precious resource for evangelization today.
It's very interesting. Most people today encounter the great treasury of the church's musical reservoir of tradition in a secular context. They don't necessarily hear it in the liturgy. They hear it replicated in concert format. That's where the great works that I've already referred to are heard in concerts, secular concerts, sometimes given in churches, of course, but in essence, they're secular events. But there's a strange grey area in that interface between the sacred and the secular, where secular people come together with people of faith to encounter these great messages from history. And these messages are of salvation. These messages are of Christ's ongoing love affair with humanity, that through the storytelling of Christ's life and death, we learn that he wanted to be one of us. We learn through the Bach Passions, and not just that, the earlier works by great composers from throughout history and right up to the present day, one hears in music and in word setting the great story that God so loved us, he wanted to become one of us. He wanted to share our history with us. And that's an amazing story still to be told through the years and the centuries to come. And it's one of the places where the secular world encounters the great story. They may have turned their back. Many people have turned their back on liturgy and traditional formats of where we hear these stories, and people are losing a sense of biblical knowledge and memory. But when they hear these stories told by the great composers, sometimes for the first time, sometimes with fresh ears, they cannot help but be confronted by the beauty. I've had some very interesting stories with young people sometimes who have heard my passion settings, and my passion settings are done in English. And some people when they hear my passion setting, whether it's the St. John or the St. Luke, have told me that they've actually heard the story for the first time. Now, whether that's literally the case or whether they've blanked so much out of their Christian upbringing that they just thought they were going to be bored by it, but when they encounter it in the world of culture, in the world of music, they can hear it afresh. And it's a startling story, it's a stark story, it's a dramatic story. It's a story which grips the heart, which grips the imagination. And if they can do it with modern music, they can certainly do it when they reach back into time and encounter the great works of the past as well. So that great treasury of sacred music from the past and still informing the present is something that will continue to rebound and have an impact on our post-religious, some might even say post-secular world today and in the future.
I think the challenge will be for the church to then be prepared for those who are coming through these experiences of beauty, coming back to liturgy, coming back to the faith, coming back for catechesis and evangelization, to be truly ready to take that moment of grace and now have it come alive in a full Christian way of life.
Yeah, and I'd be alarmed if there were those in the church who had given up on that treasury. And because there have been indications that, in a sense, because some of our fellow Christians regard all this music now being taken over by the secular world, that it's not ours anymore, which would be a great shame. And perhaps we could learn a lot as Christians, as Catholics, from this lesson, this example of the secular world embracing our music and making it part of their secular context. Why is it that they see those secular people, those the unchurched, as it were, why is it that they see great beauty in the great treasury of the church's musical history, whereas we, in some ways, have given up on it? And perhaps we need to re-educate ourselves as Christians as to why this music is so important, why it was important in the first place, why composers from the past were midwives of faith, where they in bringing their great gifts of music and other arts to the service of the church, they helped in the evangelization. And if the church can't embrace the artist, if the church regards the arts as now being colonized by the secular world and therefore not our concern anymore, we're losing a lot, and we're losing a great opportunity, and I think we're losing our handle on that great mysterious world of evangelization. Sometimes, of course, words can change minds and hearts and souls, and some great preachers do that. But sometimes a bar of music can have more of an impact on a listener than hours and hours of sermonizing.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's precisely why this document is significant in its emphasis on beauty as a path to encounter God. I think there's the recognition that we cannot lose this. This is, in fact, what the church has given to the world And so we can't just, give up on that at this very critical moment when we need to evangelize those who are unchurched, those who have turned away from faith, but do it through this power of beauty in the arts. So continuing that theme of beauty, the text goes on to say that art can have the merit of opening the person to the language of the senses, helping him or her to remain not only a spectator of the work of art, but to join in the performance. I'd love to hear what this means to you as a composer, to say that when the church uses art, beauty, in evangelization, it really invites a person to join in the performance.
I think so. One of the reasons that people who love music speak about the impact of music on their lives is that they feel as if their lives have been taken up by this music, that they're entering into new territory, a beguiling and beautiful place, which in a sense they can't control. And so one of the great impacts about art music on the listener is the fact that it demands attention. It demands our listening. There's a kind of an obedience of listening. And obedience is not a very popular word these days, as we're beginning to understand. Even in the churches, we don't like being compelled. And there is something about the concert scenario which does compel us. We are asked, we're not forced, of course, we don't need to go, but we're asked, we're invited to be quiet and to give our attention totally to this objective other, which speaks to us. And there's a realization that obedience is necessary, and that sense of obedience opens us up to the possibility of being changed, to the possibility of transformation actually taking place in a spiritual sense, as well as in a cultural sense and an artistic sense. And therefore it's analogous to the power of prayer. I've always thought that sometimes listening to music, listening to performance, does invite the listener to get lost in the music in a way that sometimes prayer can do that. If one gives ourselves over to the obedience of contemplation and reflection, one opens us up to the opportunity of a direct contact with the divine. I think that happens in prayer, and I think that happens in music too. And that's why these encounters are so important, and they can be so convulsive to the person's spiritual soul, to the psyche, to the brain, to the heart, to the intellect, but also to the deep heart, the crevices of the soul, where music can sometimes get into and speak to in a way that other things cannot.
And when you think about it in terms of the digital world in which we live now, where there's such a premium on reaction and response, I think what performance does, as you said, it calls us to obedience, but there's a certain sense in which what we've lost is receptivity, is contemplation, the ability to be silent and just to really contemplate something, to hold it, to gaze on it, as it were. And of course, in listening, it's the sound that one is gazing on with the ears, with your ears. And so I think all of those aspects that are lost in our digital world, where everything is so much focused on responding immediately, instantly, whereas this is kind of really an antidote, if you will, to that what we've lost, which is a sense of receptivity and contemplation.
Absolutely. And there are so many distractions in our modern world, not just the noise in big cities, but the way that media interferes with us, is flung into our lives and engages in quite an aggressive way, taking over our perceptions and attention so much that there's nothing left. There's no space left sometimes for those necessary deep contemplations and reflections that are so important for the way that a person needs to listen to a piece of music, or indeed the way that a person needs to listen to the silent words and messages of the divine. Prayer is difficult in our modern life because it's been edged out by all these other things, and sometimes the deep listening that, as I say, is also analogous to prayer, can sometimes be peripheralized in our life. It's becoming more and more difficult to put aside the time necessary for these things. And I suppose as artists, as well as the faithful generally, we've got to be activists for the power of music and the power of these other things of which we're speaking.
And perhaps maybe that's one good thing that might come out of the pandemic experience of being in lockdown and isolation is to, again, cultivate that interior life of receptivity and listening and contemplation. And so, again, that sense of the arts playing that important role in helping us recover that. As we conclude, James, are there any other themes in the Directory for Catechesis that you wish to comment on?
I'm just so delighted that the Directory of the Catechesis is considering the role of the arts in the life of the Church. It seems an odd thing to say because the arts are so central to Christian civilization. But for all the things that we've talked about today, they can sometimes get ignored or sidelined by more important priorities. And as I say, if the Church and the institutions of learning within the Church are to embrace these great cultural strands in our history and in our aspirations, and make them work for the search for the divine, the search for God, then I think that these are very important trends indeed. We should also remember that the world of music is not just a museum culture, in the same way that the Church is not just a museum culture, it's a living culture with a future, a vibrant future. We're not living in post-religious times, post-Christian times. The Church is very alive. We may be facing very difficult problems, but the Church has always faced difficult problems. Ever since Peter heard the cock crow, the Church has been in a sense of crisis. And perhaps the Church needs artists who are willing to engage with that sense of crisis and make it sound in their work and be heard and seen in their art, so that religious music, religious art is not just a kind of soft soap to make us feel better, but actually something that will inspire us to see deeply into the abyss and to see why Christ wanted to come to be part of the abyss and to share our lives. And that's a huge responsibility, not just for artists and composers, but for people like yourselves who are involved in the catechesis of the faithful.
And so in one sense, the musician has a prophetic role. That's what I'm hearing you say, a prophetic role in calling both the Church and the world to return to that outpouring of divine love that God wishes to give, but to do that through beauty, through the encounter with beauty that you have dedicated your life and your work to. So, James, thank you so much for sharing your insights on music as a path to encounter God. You've given us a lot to think about, and I know our audience is inspired. I'm so grateful that you've shared this time with our audience today. Prayers and best wishes for your work, and thank you so very much.
You're very welcome. It's been lovely to have joined you today.
Thank you. Stay tuned for our next conversation on Echoing Faith Today. Till then, keep the faith and keep sharing the faith. I'm Dr. Jem Sullivan, and have a blessed day. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Echoing Faith Today, hosted by Dr. Jem Sullivan, produced by the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America, and edited by Anthony Apostolides.